What if spiritual texts were actually describing human consciousness? Now, before we begin, this video is not about blindly attacking religion. It's also not about trying to sound deep. This is about something much deeper. The deeper I studied, the more one realization started becoming impossible for me to ignore. What if many ancient spiritual teachings were never meant to be understood only literal? Because once you begin comparing these ancient texts with psychology and even modern neuroscience, the overlap becomes disturbing. These are different civilizations, different languages, different time periods. Yet, they all somehow repeatedly describe humanity almost the same way. Spiritually asleep, disconnected from its true nature and trapped inside unconscious patterns. Honestly, I think modern people underestimate how psychologically advanced many of these ancient teachings actually were. Ancient mystics understood something modern society is only beginning to rediscover. A human being who cannot observe their own mind can be controlled by it, which means that a person controlled by unconsciousness can be controlled by the world around them. And this may be the deepest hidden teachings of all. Now, one thing that appears constantly across these mystical traditions is the idea that humanity is asleep, not psychologically, but consciously. You see, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus repeatedly speaks almost as if people can't truly see reality. And it's not because reality is hidden, it's because our perception itself is distorted. Now, in modern psychology, people rarely realize how much of their behavior is unconscious. You see, most of our thoughts are repetitive. Most of our emotional reactions were conditioned. And your identity structures, those were inherited. People think they are consciously choosing their lives, but they are being unconsciously driven by many things. Things like fear, trauma, social conditioning, your ego, attachment, validation, survival programming. Again, ancient mystics understood this deeply. This is why awakening was always perceived as seeing or perceiving, remembering, becoming conscious. Even phrases today reveal the same symbolism. We say things like, I finally see, that opened my eyes, that illuminated me, that woke me up. Awareness itself has always been symbolized as light, and unconsciousness as darkness. And this symbolism exists almost everywhere. In Christian mysticism, in hermeticism, Gnosticism, in Eastern spirituality, and even alchemy. That is not accidental. One of the most radical teachings in the Gospel of Thomas says, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. Now, think carefully about what that implies psychologically. Because if the kingdom is within, then spirituality stops being merely external. Now the focus shifts towards inner transformation, inner awareness, inner perception. And honestly, this is where modern religion and ancient mysticism often diverge. Because institutional systems usually focus heavily on external behavior. But mystical teachings, they focused on internal consciousness. That is a massive difference. One manages behavior, the other transforms perception itself. And when perception changes, reality begins changing too. Not magically, psychologically. Because your perception influences you. It influences your decisions. It influences your emotional states, your relationships, your opportunities, your confidence, even your behaviors. Understand that your inner world shapes how you experience your outer world. Modern psychology is barely rediscovering this now. Now, here's where things get extremely interesting, psychologically. Across mystical traditions, there's repeated emphasis on death and rebirth. This symbolizes the death of the false self, the ego identity. This is the conditioned self that was built through fear, detachments, validations, insecurity, status, trauma, social programming. Even modern psychology now recognizes that much of personality is conditioned adaptation. People become versions of themselves based on survival, not truth. And ancient teachings repeatedly warned about this. That's why mystical traditions constantly taught self-observation, meditation, silence, detachedness, awareness, because awareness weakens unconscious identification. And honestly, most people are not only suffering because of circumstances. They are suffering because they are psychologically fused with unconscious patterns they never learned to observe. And that changes everything. Now, here's the part that most people rarely discuss. Mysticism becomes dangerous to systems of control because it emphasizes direct experience, direct knowing, direct awareness, not blind dependency. And historically, that creates tension because conscious people become harder to manipulate through fear, shame, guilt, and conditioning. A person who begins observing their thoughts, their reactions, their emotional triggers, their unconscious patterns, becomes psychologically independent. And psychologically independent people are difficult to control. That's one reason many mystical traditions were pushed outside institutional orthodoxy throughout history. Not necessarily because every mystical idea was correct, but because awareness itself changes people. And systems built on unconsciousness often fear awareness. The society we live right now may be one of the most psychologically overstimulated environments humans have ever lived in. We live in constant strolling, constant stimulation, constant outrage, constant distractions. People rarely sit alone with themselves anymore. And that matters because silence forces self-confrontation. This is why ancient teachings emphasized silence, because silence increases awareness, and awareness interrupts unconscious living. But modern systems profit from distraction because distracted people are easier to influence, easier to manipulate emotionally, easier to program psychologically. That's why attention itself has become one of the most valuable forms of energy in modern society. And if you think about it, many ancient teachings warned humanity about unconsciousness long before social media ever existed. Now let's clarify something important. Awakening is not thinking you are superior. It is not believing that you know everything. And it definitely is not performative spirituality online. Real awakening is painful because it forces you to confront your own conditioning, your ego, your fears, your projection, all your unconscious behaviors. It's forcing radical self-honesty. This is why most people avoid awakening, because the ego prefers familiar suffering over uncomfortable truth. But transformation begins the moment you become capable of observing yourself clearly, without illusions, without performance, without denial. That is where real change begins. Maybe ancient spiritual teachings were never merely about religion. Maybe they were a map of consciousness. Maybe light always symbolized awareness. Maybe rebirth symbolized psychological transformation. Maybe salvation symbolized liberation from unconsciousness itself. And maybe the reason these teachings continue resurfacing across history is because something inside humanity recognizes them. A deeper memory, a deeper knowing that there is more to consciousness, more to reality, and more to human existence than most people were ever taught. And once you begin recognizing the symbolism, you can never unsee it. Until the next one.